Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Follow the campaign for grade level reading at Reading by Third on Twitter and X, at grade level reading on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. And follow us on YouTube at grade level reading. We'd like to take a minute before we get started to thank some of our sponsors, our enterprise funders and our programmatic funders. We appreciate everything that you do in making these webinars possible. And before we get started, we did want to take a moment to go over some housekeeping tips for the webinar. So please introduce yourself in the chat box. We want to know who's here. And you are in listen-only mode, but you will be able to pose questions to our panelists through the Q&A box. There's also the chat for interacting with each other or making any kind of resources or comments you want to make on the webinar. That's what the chat is for. Q&A if you have questions specifically for the panelists. We are recording the webinar and will be made available by the end of the week in a follow-up email. You'll also receive all of the resources and things shared during the webinar. We are live streaming on Facebook, and there will be a brief survey that pops up about 10 minutes before the end of the session. If you could take a moment to fill that out about the webinar, we really appreciate it. It helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And if you have to leave early for any reason, be on the lookout because there will be a brief survey about halfway through the webinar or around the 4 o'clock hour in which you can click and fill that out early. So those are our housekeeping tips. And then we have a few upcoming webinars. We have more than this that we've just confirmed today. But we do have a Crucible of Practice next week with First 10 communities and early math. So this is a follow-on to a different math conversation we had last week. And then that is about the Young Mathematicians Initiative in New York, Pennsylvania. And then we have a partner webinar later that day on schools as safe spaces, beyond active shooter drills to trusting relationships, about the need for a culture of safety and security in schools, not just walls and security. And with that, I will turn it over to Sierra Sanchez. She is webinar producer and session lead with us here at Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and she's going to take it away.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you everyone for hopping on and joining us for today's session. We are so excited to dig into today's conversation about what makes P3 leadership so essential and how we can build stronger systems to support it. We at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading know that strong school leadership makes a huge difference in student outcomes. And when it comes to the early years, from pre-K through third grade, principals play a particularly important role. They're uniquely positioned kind of at the crossroads of early childhood and K-12, and they help shape the kind of teaching, learning, and relationships that lay the foundation for the long-term success that our students experience. But to lead well in these early years, principals also need more than just general leadership skills. They need preparation and support that reflects what early learning really looks like, which could range anything from developmentally appropriate practices, family engagement, aligned instruction, and much, much more. Thankfully, we've seen some really exciting work happening across the country where pockets of innovation, where P3 leadership is really taking hold. And we're excited to be able to take a peek into what that work consists of in today's webinar and conversation. This is also a follow-on from our conversation that we had earlier this year, and I'll be reposting that link in the chat for folks who might want to take a look back and see what that previous session consisted of. And with that, I am excited to jump in and introduce our wonderful panel who we have here with us today. Just a note, I'm sharing very brief bios of our folks that are joining us as panelists, but the full bios will be posted in the chat box for folks who want to read further. Ty Bizurto is the Director of School Leader Development for Chicago Public Schools Department of Principal Quality. She creates and implements meaningful and differentiated professional learning for school leaders across the district. Prior to her current role, Ty was the principal at John C. Dorr Elementary School for 6 years. Erica Hunt is co-director for the Lead Hub at Row 17, a role she began in May of 2022. Previously, she spent 18 years at Illinois State University as co-director and senior policy analyst in the Center for the Study of Education Policy. And as a former member for Governor Jim Edgar, she has served on various state task forces and the governor's P-20 Education Council. Christy Cowers is executive and founding director of the National P-3 Center and research professor at University of Colorado Denver's School of Education and Human Development. She has been a policy advisor to 2 Colorado governors and was the founding director of Education Commission of the State's Early Learning Initiative. And Steve Tozer is professor emeritus and past university scholar in education policy studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He was founding director of the UIC Center for Urban Education Leadership and founding coordinator of the UIC EDD program in urban education, which has won awards from multiple national organizations for its impact on Chicago schools. Steve began his career as a Hull House kindergarten teacher and director of an early childhood center in Uptown Chicago. And moderating today's wonderful conversation is Rotunda Floyd Cooper. Rotunda serves as Vice President for Education Leadership at the Wallace Foundation. Lee, if you want to move to the next slide so we can see her. She is responsible for the leadership of the Education Leadership Program unit and the Interdisciplinary Education Leadership Strategy team, which comprises representatives from the Foundation's program, research, and communications units. Rotunda also oversees the Equity-Centered Pipeline Initiative, a major initiative designed to explore how to build comprehensive, aligned principal pipelines that can produce school leaders capable of advancing their district's vision for supporting leaders responsible and advancing outcomes for students from lower opportunities. And with that, I'm excited to jump on into today's conversation. Rotunda, I will pass it off to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Sierra, for that fantastic introduction, as well as a great introduction to our outstanding panelists for today. It really is a delight to share space with so many brilliant leaders from the field, like Campaign for Grade Level Reading, particularly because you're an organization with whom I perceive as mission aligned to the work that each of us on the screen is committed to doing each day. I'm most impressed and thrilled to have learned about your work acting as a hub and a dissemination channel and accelerator for existing and emerging practice, policy, data, and research. The centering and prioritizing of your mission to disrupt generational cycles of poverty by improving prospects for early school success for children growing up in fragile and traditionally marginalized communities is really inspiring, and I'm honored to moderate this discussion that you've curated today. As mentioned earlier, I'm Rotunda Floyd Cooper, and I'm extremely fortunate that each day I have the opportunity to serve as the Vice President of Education Leadership at the Wallace Foundation. My greatest source of pride in being a part of the team at the Wallace Foundation, aside from having the opportunity to work alongside such brilliant and thoughtful individuals each day, is knowing the personal connection that I have, having been a beneficiary of the tremendous research contributions of the Wallace Foundation during my nearly 30-year career as a professional educator, of which I spent almost 20 as a public school system leader. The Wallace Foundation has been deeply engrossed in the work of focusing on the role of the school leader and principal since the early 2000s. We've continued that focus on the role of the principal for more than 25 years and continue that work through furthering research, multi-year grants, and partnerships aimed at establishing leadership pipelines, enhancing leadership training, and creating policies that support the development of school leaders. So that is a great part of what makes today's conversation so important to me, and I hope insightful and valuable to each individual participating in this webinar. So why do principles matter? And more specifically, why do elementary principles matter? We know that principals play a crucial role in shaping the culture, success, and stability of our schools. They're not just administrators, they're leaders who set the tone for everything from academic achievement to student well-being. They matter because they create the vision and leadership for each of our schools. Strong principals provide direction and inspire teachers. They set the stage for strong culture and morale, creating environments where teachers feel supported and students feel motivated. They're problem solvers and decision makers, contributors to academic standards and growth, guiding curriculum decisions and helping improve teaching practices. And obviously, they create strong connections to communities. As it relates to elementary principals, we know that the impact of replacing a below average elementary principal with an above average principal could result in an additional almost 3 months of math learning and nearly 3 months of reading learning each year for students in a school. So if we add up the effects of an above average principal in an elementary school, this could result in a cumulative nearly 2 years of growth for a child between pre-K and grade 3. So as we continue to embark upon this conversation today, I want to start us out by acknowledging my belief that bringing together the fields of school leadership and P3 really does hold potential because it leverages two essential priorities that have proven effective in improving student outcomes. Today's panel brings together people who have led and continue to lead at the intersection of principles and P3. I know that Sierra gave us a fantastic brief introduction of each of our panelists, and I could say so much more about each of the amazing folks on the panel, but I'm certain that through our dialogue today, they'll share more about their rich backgrounds and experiences that lead them to believe in the opportunity to merge these two important worlds of work in the P3 space and in school leadership. So let's jump right into this conversation. To open the conversation, I think it will be great for us to hear a little more about the current efforts to bridge school leadership and P3. And for that, I'm going to lean into my friend and thought partner and critical challenger, Dr. Christy Cowers.
My goodness, those are big words to live into. Critical challenger. I love that. Thank you, Rotunda, for being part of this panel. It's really an honor to get to be with a leader of the organization that I think has really put principles on the roadmap in this country as being essential to school reform. Thanks to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for hosting this conversation. So I want to review back just a minute, as Sierra had suggested. This is a follow-up to a conversation we had back in January that was co-led by the National P3 Center and the National Association of Elementary School Principals. Gracie, it's nice to have you on today. One of the first questions we get asked in this topic is, well, gosh, don't we need to know what makes an effective elementary school principal? And we actually have known that, and NAESP has known that and led in that space for more than 20 years now, with their guides to the competencies for elementary principals who lead on behalf of early learning and the early grades. This is a cover shot of their most recent set of competencies that the National P3 Center had the privilege and honor of working on with them, that was put out a few years ago. So we absolutely already know what are the competencies of effective P3 principals. The next question, though, is really, how do we get to effective P3 principals at scale? At last count, there was 13 different P3 leadership programs in existence around the country, including one that I lead NAESP has one. University of Connecticut has one. There are a couple happening in North Carolina. All around the country, we have at least 13 different programs. However, including mine, humbly speaking, they're small scale, boutique efforts. And so the bigger question is, how do we get to scale so that we can be improving not only disparities in outcomes that are reflections of children's learning opportunities, how can we improve those opportunities and therefore close or reduce those disparities at scale? And so this has become a really important question for us at the National P3 Center over the last several years. A close partner of mine, Steve Tozer, who you're going to hear from, he and I put our heads together a few years ago and thought about convening a group of thought leaders to really think about how do we link these worlds of school leaders and P3. And so we convened a group of folks in Chicago almost 2 years ago now to really dig into this. And this report, Sierra will drop a link to the report in chat, was issued last year that focuses on not just leadership programs once principals are in their positions, but thinking about how do we infuse P3 into principal preparation so that every principal, every aspiring principal is given not only the content, but also the field experiences that will make them effective leaders on behalf of early learning and the early grades. Our vision is to ensure that all of the nation's elementary schools are led by principals who not only understand the science of young children's learning and development, but are also skilled in creating the school climates that nurture the unique aspects of high quality teaching and learning across P3, which we know also includes meaningful partnerships with families and community-based early care and education programs. In the report, we identify 5 essential drivers to getting to effective P3 principles at scale. State policy absolutely plays a role. States and state education agencies are the one who set standards for principals. They set evaluation standards. They're the ones that license and credential principals and also accredit and support institutions of higher ed inside states. So there's a role for state policy. We also think about institutions of higher education and other principal preparation programs. Obviously, that's where principals are going for their pre-service learning. And then school districts are another important driver. Large, small, urban, rural school districts are always thinking about their pipeline of leaders, who's currently in those seats, who will be in those seats, who needs to be hired into principal roles, what kinds of ongoing professional learning and professional development are provided to principals. So school districts in their range of pipeline efforts are really important. And then encircling those 3 primary drivers, we know that research plays an important role in driving scale. And we also know that national organizations, including funders, including advocacy organizations, including the federal government. Once upon a time, not too many months ago, the U.S. Department of Education was a big leader in this. We know we have challenges ahead, but we still see important roles for these national and federal organizations in moving forward in this work. And so for the next few moments of this webinar, you're going to hear from 3 of our speakers painting the picture of the state of Illinois and Chicago public schools. Illinois is a bit of an outlier right now because they have intersected many of these 5 drivers to create a statewide context that is thinking about not just principals generally, but also elementary principals and their efforts to support pre-K and also the early grades, kindergarten through third grade. So delighted to have the opportunity for you to hear from voices of the people who have done and continue to lead this work in Illinois.
Thanks so much, Christy. We appreciate your sharing. To bring to life, as Christy shared, how these drivers can be levers for change, our next panelists will reflect on their shared history in Illinois. Illinois is a state that, frankly, has served as a model for many in reflecting how district-specific work can be leveraged as a resource to promote sustainability and spread of best practices. Illinois has leveraged all 5 of these drivers that Christy shared with us to influence their principal preparation. So we'll get started with Ty Borsuto, who we know has been a Chicago educator for more than 2 decades and is currently serving as the Director of School Leader Development. And we'll follow Ty to hear from Steve Tozier, Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we will round out our conversation with Erica Hunt, who we know is the Director of the Lead Hub at ROE number 17. So I'll turn it over to you, Ty.
All right, and everyone will forgive me because I work in a Google district. And so this Zoom muting and unmuting is a little foreign to me, so you'll be patient with me. Hi, everyone. My name is Ty Bizzurdo. I'm the Director of School Leader Development for Chicago Public Schools Department of Principal Quality. And my department is really immersed in this work, but I hope that during the brief presentation that I have for you, I'll also be able to get meta on the ways that this work has impacted my own journey. So the work of the Department of Principal Quality is to support 1,100 school leaders in the district, both principals and assistant principals. But we also are cognizant of our aspiring school leaders, which represent hundreds of teacher leaders, as well as those who have retired, who we still try to hold on to and support in additional ways. But we've been really reflective in thinking about how those the pathways to leadership are not always linear. I was a middle school ELA teacher for over 10 years before transitioning to school leadership, and never imagined that I would go on to be an elementary school principal, or that I would be in the position that I am now. One of the things that I want to center in the work that I do is the importance of shared community among our school leaders. And I want to be attentive to that, recognizing that all of the levers that we've discussed are important, but it's also vital that school leaders have other school leaders to lead into. And so our department creates professional learning. This is the branch of the department that I lead, for school leaders, and that professional development is really intentional about being differentiated so that school leaders can choose the pathways that make the most sense for their learning. We can go on to the next slide. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. As I said, I was a middle school ELA teacher for over 10 years. And let me tell you, I was terrified of the littles. I told my principal that if she ever wanted to see me leave, all she had to do was switch me out of middle school. I also did not have any exposure to young children outside of work. I don't have nieces and nephews. I'm not a parent myself. And so when I then decided that I wanted to transition to school leadership and entered the EDD program at UIC, where Steve Tozier was my first professor, I was really intentional about ensuring that I created opportunities for myself to immerse myself in primary grade classrooms. And so that's where I spent the majority of the time during my residency. You see that picture off to the side of this slide, and it says, "A little said I needed a head massage." And let me tell you, what I discovered was there was so much joy and learning happening in these classrooms. I had no idea. And I wish in retrospect that as a middle school teacher, I had have had greater exposure to what was happening in our early grade classrooms because so much of that would have made me a better middle school teacher. There is a joy that exists in those classrooms that we sometimes lose as students get older. And when I transitioned to the principalship, it was a goal and aspiration of mine to have that joy exist throughout our building. I unexpectedly became the principal of the school that I was an assistant principal at and had just one pre-K classroom. I knew that in order to be effective in leading both my pre-K, kindergarten, first and second grade classrooms, that I needed to learn more. And so I sought out additional professional learning opportunities like Vocel's Bell program. And then in 2019, I opened a new building, moved my pre-K through 8th grade to a different location, and reopened my former building as an early childhood center. Again, this is someone who has no background in early childhood. And so from that point on, I knew that I had an obligation to really engage with my pre-K through second grade teachers to ensure that I was learning so that I could be the most effective leader for them possible. And now that I'm in my current role, I am really passionate about ensuring that our early childhood teacher leaders feel that there's a pathway for them to school leadership and that we're intentional about our development of school leaders around early childhood. We can go to the next slide. So currently, as I said, we provide differentiated professional development for about 1,100 school leaders. And the way that I have structured this is we've created tiers of learning. So our tier 1 learning is where we're meeting all of our new principals, all of our new APs. And I hypothesize that 10 years from now, every school leader in the district will have gone through this initial learning. But then our tier 2 learning is small group learning that school leaders opt into based on their own interests and their own learning needs. The past 2 years, we have partnered with the Office of Early Childhood Education to have a PLC for school leaders who do not have a background in early childhood or want to just strengthen their early childhood lens. And the focus of this has been on them understanding developmentally appropriate instruction and how to utilize data that they just may not be proficient in to support teachers in making classroom decisions. We can go to the next slide. So finally, where are we? What do I see as being on the horizon for my work? The district, which is made up of just under 600 schools, has pre-K programs in 371 schools. That means we're serving over 1,900 pre-K students. Our total for students in pre-K through second grade is over 85,000. So we have an obligation to be intentional about the ways that we support these students and the adults that lead them. This year, I currently support 51 first-year principals, and of those, 28 have a pre-K program in their buildings. I have some new principals who have a high school background, but are now in a pre-K through 8th grade setting. The district has a new 5-year plan that really centers pre-K as one of its major priorities. So we'll continue to strengthen our partnership with OECE to ensure that this work continues to be done. And then finally, what we're doing as a department is just working to ensure that there is a constant attention to continuous improvement, that where we're at is not where we're going to be. And we continue to strive to meet these students' needs in the best way possible and ensure that those teachers feel supported, because our principals do not function on islands. Our principals are integral to our teachers feeling successful, and ultimately then that truly gets to our students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ty, for sharing your personal history with preparation, a little bit about the work that you do there in Chicago Public Schools, and how you are actively collaborating with your colleagues in the pre-K to 2 setting to build the capacity of principals who are interested in either transitioning to early learning settings or who might have limited experiences there. I loved hearing how Chicago Public Schools prioritizes principals and how you've been able to keep a sharpened focus there, even through changes in leadership throughout your district. And love hearing about the pipeline efforts and ways in which exposure to and engagement with early learning grades is included in your approach. So thank you so much. We'll transition now to hearing from someone who has lots of experience in the preparation work for principals, Dr. Steve Tozier, Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Tozier.
I was all set to go, and as people do, everybody who's older than 60 forgets to unmute. If you ever notice that happens. All right, so thanks an awful lot. I'm going to blast you through 3 slides because I know that you're going to have an opportunity to look at these slides later. These are going to be made available to you. So I'm going to introduce you to the content here, and we can come back to discussing this if we're careful about leaving a little time for the end. So first of all, there's almost a 40-year history here so that you can see how Chicago got where it's got. In 1987, Chicago was declared the worst school system in America by William Bennett, the U.S. Secretary of Education. And in 88, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, and its allies passed a school reform bill in the state legislature to do something about this because we didn't have enough evidence to refute that we were the worst school system in America, and there was too much evidence in support of Bennett's claim. Roughly 50% dropout rate in high schools, for example, is not where you want to be. In 2001, Arne Duncan, who you'll all remember from the as Secretary of Education, and Barbara Eason Watkins, a former elementary school principal, assumed the leadership of CPS, and their mantra became, the school is the unit of change and the principal is the leader of change. And you'll see why that becomes so significant in just a few minutes. From 2002 to 2003, early in their tenure, New Leaders for New Schools, now called New Leaders, UIC and CPS, began to form principal partnerships in which the school system changed, higher ed, namely UIC, changed, and New Leaders changed. A new office for principal development was formed in CPS. That's where Ty Basurdo is now. We began to have full-time, full-year paid principal residencies for anybody who was going to get endorsed as a principal in CPS. The programs became highly selective, and in fact, CPS got the right from the state to require competencies above and beyond the state principal certificate. We then began developing on-site coaching for principal residents and post-residents, that is to say new principals got on-site coaching, largely from a new cadre of veteran principals who became full-time supervisors and coaches in CPS. In the first decade, UIC and New Leaders alone provided 300 new principals for CPS, and the majority of them were leaders of color. Leadership and early childhood education faculty at UIC collaborated with foundation funding to redesign our program so that all candidates in the program would be P-3 proficient. All 3 editions of the NASP guide for P-3 learning communities were used in the UIC program going back to its beginning. And UIC and ISU, where Erica Hunt was at the time, provided consultation to strengthen the P-3 program in New Leaders. All right, the next slide. I'll move a little more quickly. There are multiple indicators of the impact of those efforts. For one of them, UIC was asked to lead the state task force to reform principal certificate, and we partnered with Erica Hunt at ISU in doing that. UIC principals were appointed the chief of early childhood ed in Chicago Public Schools, as well as the chief of teaching and learning, as well as the CEO and the chief ed officer, and in fact, several state level positions. So UIC, the Chicago Public Schools, instead of an importer of talent, became an exporter of talent. A great many suburban superintendents now have come out of that program. The UIC program design received multiple awards, which you've heard already, and today 135 CPS leaders at the school level and the district level are graduates from this program. This had a profound impact on student outcomes By 2016, CPS third graders exceeded their state counterparts. Our black kids were doing better than the rest of the state's black kids. Our white kids were doing better. Our Latino kids were doing better. And also by 2016, CPS's Latino kids, that's our largest population group in CPS, exceeded Illinois white non-Latino students in reading above and below the free and reduced lunch line. In other words, we didn't just catch up on the achievement gap, we reversed it against the rest of the state. And that's the largest population group in CPS. By 2017, a Stanford study showed that Chicago Public Schools was in the top 4% of U.S. districts in academic growth from grades 3 through 8. And most of that growth was coming by the end of grade 3. There was something happening between pre-K and grade 3 that was producing the growth that led to 6 years of learning for 5 years of schooling. Last slide. What happened? Well, look at the Breich reference there. If you really want to read in depth, Tony Breich and I and others wrote a book called How a City Learned to Improve Its Schools. On the right-hand side in that diagram, what you see is a great deal of civic engagement was part of what happened in Chicago to create this dramatic turnaround over a 15-year period. There was a tremendous information infrastructure going so that there was constant data presented to the public about how we were doing on school reform. There was a real focus on teaching and learning. And all of this got funneled in sort of the number one thing that without which this other stuff doesn't matter. And that is the development of teachers and principals in the school system. And in fact, these are not separate things. For us at UIC, teacher learning becomes job one for all principals. And that's kind of counterintuitive. Principals think, wait, I'm there for the kids. Well, first and foremost, you're there to develop teachers, because if you don't develop teachers, you're not going to be able to reach the kids. So what happened was that this was a tremendous exercise in learning by doing. We knew that principals, by the way, in Ty's case, for example, there are 5 elementary positions for every single secondary position in CPS in the principalship. So we've got to develop our secondary leaders who are able to lead early childhood and P-3 programs just as much as we need to develop our elementary teachers. So in P-3 learning, our principals had to learn it's about learning by doing. It doesn't look like knowledge transmission in a traditional way. In principal prep, we didn't really know how to do this well when we started. We learned how to do it by doing it. In creating partnerships that dramatically changed the school system, we didn't have a roadmap for that. We learned how to do it by doing it. And I would encourage all of you in your own environments to set out to do what needs to be done and learn how to do it as you go. All right, that's it for me. I'm looking forward to conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that long story of Illinois. Long and notable story about the work that has happened in Chicago specifically and in Illinois as a state. We're going to turn our attention to Erica Hunt. And Erica, as we know, is currently working at the Lead Hub in ROE number 17. And I'm excited to hear from Erica, particularly about how Illinois state leaders and statewide organizations scaled some of the local innovations that Dr. Tozer discussed with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Erica.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Erica Hunt, and I work at a regional office of education in Illinois. Our regional offices are intermediary centers between the State Board of Education and our local school districts. But before I came to work in the regional office, I ran a P-20 policy center for 18 years at Illinois State University. And I also served on the governor's P-20 council for 12 years through 3 different governors. So that's where the bulk of this work happened, is through the policy work we were doing at that time. So I'm here to talk to you today about the state driver in this work. And really it's how does the state drive the number 2 driver, which is institutions of education, higher education. And in Illinois, we were able to do this through the creation of legislation that led to a P-12 principal endorsement. And you can see here on the slide what the P-12 principal endorsement in Illinois resulted in. What does it mean? And you can see there's two key drivers in this. First, if you look at number 4, this is a P-12 principal license, and this was by design. We are the only state that I know of that actually requires the incorporation of early learning and early grade content into the principal license for all principals in the state. And then you can see in the second, under number 5, this is really accomplished both in the curriculum and the clinical experience through a performance-based internship that is driven by competencies, and there are actually competencies aligning P3 and that have to be integrated into all preparation programs coursework and their clinical experiences. So I want to talk a little bit about today. This is a great accomplishment, but this did not happen without purposeful design. And it happened through a number of ways. One was multiple task force that were put together to shape this by bringing many voices to the table. We also were able to really have some pilot programs like UIC's program that Steve talked about where we could push up some of these effective practices that we knew were demonstrated for their impact on the learning impact we were trying to receive. And then we also had design teams. When we brought together design teams, we purposely brought voices to the table that normally are not at the table, both in higher education and in the practitioner voice. We called this subpopulations in Illinois at that time, but they were early childhood, early grade teachers, and also special education and English learners. And at that time, we really often, when we had task force or implementation task force, we always had the same people represented on it. And we really purposely tried to bring in this broad reach of bringing in other voices that aren't typically there. So that really resulted in the development of the legislation and what you see here. But I also want to talk about how we were very intentional in the implementation of this. And the implementation of this took years as well, where thanks to funders, we were able to put together, we did technical assistance to universities. I'll give one example of Loyola University, in which the dean voluntarily close their program before the legislation took place because they knew that the program that they currently were offering did not prepare the type of principals that we needed. And so what that required is their faculty to work hand in hand with faculty across other programs, including early childhood, special ed, and their English learner, to just completely redesign the kind of courses and experiences that they needed to prepare these kind of principals. So we had a lot of bold leadership that really embraced this work in Illinois, and that led to this. I also do want to note, though, that the funding community was instrumental in this. In fact, we could not have accomplished this without multiple funders that came to the table. This work really started through a Wallace Foundation grant that really kind of created the kind of policy impetus and also staffing support for this to happen. And then that brought other funders like the McCormick Foundation and the Stone Foundation to the table. In fact, we had funders coming and pooling their resources together to make this happen. So for others that are looking to do this work in your state, it's really important to bring lots of different stakeholders to the table, not just higher ed faculty, policymakers, and the field, but also external stakeholders like your funding community. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that if you want to learn more about this work, Wallace Foundation funded a video series on this that highlights the state story in Illinois, but it also highlights the work that happened at UIC, Chicago Public Schools, and New Leaders. It's a great video series to listen to that'll give you a real snapshot of how this work happened. And then I also put in here, we have a web page at the Center for the Study of Education Policy that lists all of the different reports and studies and articles that have been written on this work. So it's a pleasure to speak to you today about this and really hope that this provides some insight of how others might be able to replicate this work in their own state or institution or districts.
Thank you so much, Erica. It is so important to note that the partnership with Chicago Public Schools and the state of Illinois is one of the most notable partnerships that the Wallace Foundation has had. And it is one of the best examples of sustainability of such a significant effort that has such great implications for the outcomes for students. The scaling of statewide efforts in the ways that Erica and Steve began to describe really do require many key elements, including investment in time. They each mentioned that this did not happen overnight, deep collaboration. And I really appreciated hearing the challenge around seeking out partnerships in terms of philanthropy, who really is here to serve as the nation's risk capital to solve some of the most challenging problems that we have faced in this nation. So, as we continue on for the rest of our webinar, it really is important to us to ensure that participants are able to walk away with an appreciation, not just for the large scale efforts, but for the accumulation of the smaller efforts and partnerships that contributed to the large system change that you had a chance to hear about today. I want to invite each of the individuals participating here on the webinar to continue to leverage the chat as a resource to drop any questions in. I know our panelists are eager to hear from you. And as you are doing that, I'd love for us to have an opportunity to engage in a brief Q&A with each of our panelists. And I'll start with Steve and Ty for our first question. Steve and Ty, can you describe how school districts can build partnerships with higher education?
I'm happy to start on this one, and then Ty can jump in. I'll mention that a book came out in 2023 with Luis Gomez and Manuelito Biag as the lead editors of the book. I'm one of the editors as well, and the whole book is devoted to 11 case studies in creating these kinds of partnerships. So I recommend it to you. Luis Gomez is the lead editor on that, 2023.
Really quickly, Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is Sierra. I don't know if your camera's off or if you lost connection. I just wanted to make sure. I saw you were off camera.
Yeah. Let's see if I can fix that. You know, for whatever reason, my screen isn't giving me the opportunity anymore to go ahead and get back on. Hold on a second.
Okay, we can. Oh, there we go.
Okay, good. So anyway, the Gomez book is really good on partnerships. It gives not just UIC, but 10 other case studies from coast to coast on creating these district and higher ed partnerships in leadership development. And some of them are attentive to pre-K through 3, some of them are not. The second thing that I would say is that I think it's really important. I mean, leadership plays a critical role here. So I started out by going to Barbara Easton Watkins and saying, look, we got a problem. We know that our schools could be performing at a much higher level if our principals were performing at a much higher level. Can we work together to pull this off? And what's critical there is I didn't start with an answer. I started with a question, which is, how do we do this? And it took Barbara about 10 minutes to decide that she would help answer that question. So part of my advice is to create partnerships is focus on a specific problem of practice, cross the boundary to that partner that you want to work with and say, here's what seems to me to be a problem. Do you share with me the belief that this is a problem? If so, shall we work on it together? To me, that's a powerful starting place. Ty, what would you add to that?
For the audience, I just want them to know that Dr. Tozer was my capstone chair. So whenever we're asked a question together, I have to defer to him. I mean, I would just say that, especially in a city like Chicago, the both the universities and the district are thirsty for these partnerships. I partner with UIC and other universities in a number of capacities, both related to principal development and then related to instructional improvement. In fact, tomorrow I'm going to be with Dr. Barron, one of Dr. Tozer's colleagues, working with a network in the district. And so I think, we have to maintain the communication pathways. Some of the partnerships have happened because of organic connections, like my executive director and I are both graduates of the UIC program. So I think these are partnerships that we have to stretch to create. And I think given the political climate, they're ones that we need, because the fiscal responsibilities of both universities and districts is so great.
Thanks so much, Ty. We're going to turn to Erica for a question about coalitions and collaborations. Erica, would you share how you've seen coalitions and collaborations in other states that are focusing on the importance of elementary principals?
Well, I will say, I don't know if I can give some specific examples. With one example is New Mexico, which I just want to say is kind of the state to watch right now. They just passed legislation that redesigns their principal preparation programs, but also creates kind of a tiered licensure that puts in place induction and mentoring support for all new principals, and creates a new licensure for superintendents. They did not have a license for superintendents, but that also puts in place mentoring and induction programs for superintendents. And yeah, you can see the slide up here. This is really instrumental. In fact, this provides a great driver for, as they're implementing this, how do you infuse other voices to the table on this and make sure that all of the continuum is represented in this. So that's kind of an approach of, I think this was a 3-year effort in New Mexico of multiple task force developing this, and provides a great example. But I will say one thing I'm a little discouraged about that I hope starts to happen more. But before the pandemic, it was really common to have coalitions driving this work. And the pandemic really kind of halted that. And so now I see a lot of work in Illinois and other states kind of being more siloed. And I think this is where funders can really come to the table, and state agencies, is that really putting together some intentional efforts of bringing voices out there, and not just doing convenient voices of organizations or people that might normally be brought to the table, but really do broad outreach of this. That's what we had in Illinois that was really contributing in this. So I would just really give that as a point of recommendation when you're putting together these coalitions. I think when you have coalitions, it does create stronger work because people had a sense in shaping it, and that helps with the implementation of it because they have a sense of ownership that once it's getting out there and rolled out, they will help steer the implementation. So I can't speak enough about the power of coalitions and advocacy work in doing this.
I'd like to add a thought to that, Erica, as someone who's worked with you on some of these task forces and so on. We also brought people to the table who didn't really buy into what we were believing in. So it's a coalition that included people who weren't necessarily going to be friendly to where we were going. But part of the reason we did that is because of what Bryke calls in our book together social learning. That is to say, those folks got educated about some stuff that they wouldn't have been educated about if we had left them off the task force. By bringing them in to be part of the deliberative body, all of us get smarter. We get smarter by listening to each other's perspectives. But one of the things that does is it builds a greater consensus over time, as opposed to leaving out people from the task force because you know they're damn well not going to agree with you. So I would say that was, again, part of the real strength. So that's a footnote, Erica, to your point.
Thanks so much, Steve and Erica. Great suggestion to include critical friends as we try to build coalitions and collaboration. Christy, I'd love to turn to you to talk a little bit about research. What gaps in research exist regarding effective practices for school leaders working with P3 educators?
Ooh, that's a good question. And since it's a driver we didn't dig deeply into, I want to start with a bit of a side answer to your question,
Okay.
which is the kind of research that I would wish we would stop arguing over, which is research that pre-K matters. We have an abundance of evidence that pre-K matters. So I wish we would stop trying to make that case. I also think that we have an abundance of evidence about how important the K3 years are for student learning and how they are open to improvement right now. Despite the political side of the aisle that you're on, I think there's a lot of interest right now in stagnant achievement gaps at third grade and at fourth grade on NAEP scores and beyond. And so, of course, we all know that there needs to be improvements. So I would sort of wish that we would stop trying to make the same case over and over again. I think we have a volume of research that says we know that early learning and the early grades matter and matter in important ways. What I wish we could spend some more research dollars on are some of these boundary spanning. We had a quote up a minute ago about silos, and Steve Tozer really helped me think differently about this. Of course, silos exist. We have silos between pre-K and K3, silos between IHEs and school districts, silos between research policy and practice. What we need are constructive ways to bridge those silos into constructive conversation and collaboration. So some of the research that I think would be really interesting would be expanded investment in research practice partnerships that are bringing some of these drivers together: state policymakers, IHE leaders, institution of higher ed leaders, district leaders. Let's invest in how does collaboration work effectively, efficiently, and in service to these particular age and grade levels, preschool through third grade. That's sort of one area, is really thinking about these intersections between research, policy, and practice. I would love to see. I would also love to see some attention to alignment across these grade levels. And not so much at the pedagogical level. I think, again, we have a lot of work, a lot of established research on what aligned standards need to look like. A lot of places have done that. I think we have a lot of interesting work being done at the classroom level around pedagogical practices. Science of learning and development has really helped us think about this. Where I think we don't have as much research is around the mechanisms that help make that alignment institutionalized. In other words, thinking about cross-grade teacher teamwork and teacher team time. Like, what has to happen to make that happen consistently and regularly? Not just, the 190-minute session in one annual professional development offering where pre-K and K teachers get to meet. But how do we systematize some of this alignment work across grade levels in terms of teacher teamwork, in terms of family engagement? I want to pull in, I saw a couple of questions in the chat around subpopulations, including our English language learners. I would also add special education is really deepening our approach to make sure that this P3 work is influencing and benefiting all children and not just those that are just at the tier 1 level of instruction, but how are we really thinking about alignment that supports and nurtures every single child in all of our classrooms.
Fantastic food for thought for us, Christy, and love the challenges and considerations about where we can go next from a research perspective. I'd love to open the floor to any of our panelists for this last question a place where I know everyone on the call can have a contribution. As institutions of higher education, school systems, and school leaders implement initiatives to enhance the alignment in P3, what metrics or assessment tools should be used to evaluate the effectiveness of these efforts? And how can policymakers support the collection and analysis of data to drive improvements in early childhood education? This is a big one.
I can go first while others are still thinking. I see Steve thinking as well. And I don't have exact answers yet. Having been in this P3 space for almost 20 years now, one of the pieces that I wish we could get smarter about are some metrics around durability, or literally like organizational change, system change. Because what we see is a lot of short-term initiatives, where as long as there's a really sassy, savvy leader in place, this P3 work is absolutely happening. But then they go somewhere else, or the funding goes away and the work stops. And so, as I said, I don't know exactly what the metrics are, but one of the reasons I love Chicago work, and remind me, Ty and Steve, how many superintendents have there been in Chicago throughout this P3 journey, P2,
Yeah,
P3?
well, 14 in the era of school reform that we document in the book, and now it's been another now 15, but that's that's in the book. Yeah.
And so to me, this is really important because this shows that it's a priority, not just of a person, but that system change is happening, that the organization of the district itself has changed to embrace this concept. And so whoever sits in the seat continues it on. So that's a bit of a fuzzy answer to your question, Rotunda, but I do feel like some of the metrics need to be around durability.
Yeah, I want to add to that, Christine. I know I don't know what our hard stop is, but I'm worried about time, so I'll make it brief. We're good.
We're good.
I'm one of the great contributions theoretically to school leadership practice was made by Richard Elmore, although almost the same concept was put out by Leithwood in the same year, 1999. And that's the idea that good school leadership boils down to vision, systems, and people. It's really a deep thought, because basically what it's saying is you're not going to accomplish your vision without putting the systems in place to achieve that vision. And then you've got to develop the people who make those systems work, right? So what's profound about that, for the Rotunda's question for me, is this. If you have a vision of what outstanding P3 leadership looks like at the school district level, or at the state level, or at the building level, what does a vision for that look like? Then you have to ask, what systems would have to be in place to achieve that? And then you can get your metrics out of that. In other words, you can start to measure, are those systems in fact in place? Just to take a school building level, to accomplish really strong P3 at the building level, you need routines of collaboration between your pre-K and your early grades people. Do you have those routines of collaboration in place, and what's the evidence of that? If they're not in place, I can almost guarantee you're not getting very far on P3. So that's just one illustration. But you can imagine, once your vision is in place, once you have a clear vision, what are the systems that you would have to pull off that P3 vision? And that gives you your metrics. I would also say, of course, that's a great way to avoid simply falling into the let's measure achievement scores in grade 3 trap. But I do think we need to have achievement scores in grade 3. I mean, I still think we need to do that, but I think that needs to be counterbalanced and contextualized by what you were calling the metrics for durability. Are the systems in place? And if so, what's the evidence of that?
Thanks so much, Steve. Ty or Erica, we invite you to join the conversation and maybe contribute to the component of the question around the ways in which policymakers can support collection of some of this data and analysis of the data to drive improvements in early childhood.
I can give an example from the policy perspective. Illinois has a vibrant early learning community. And one of the ways that they use that to drive change practices in school, especially in kindergarten, was the implementation of a kindergarten assessment called the Kid Survey, which is an observational survey. And it was selected intentionally because what it did is it required kindergarten teachers to really have to change the structure of their classroom and their practices in order to be able to observe kids, kindergartners doing. So there was a movement in Illinois to do more structured kindergarten classrooms. And we knew that was the wrong direction. And so in order to bring back play-based learning, and incorporate that centers approach into kindergarten classrooms. The state purposefully, this was again led by a task force, and the Illinois Early Learning Council and P-20 Council were involved with this. But I think that's approach, it did get a lot of pushback at first from many kindergarten teachers because they couldn't conduct the assessment because their classrooms were structured. And so they would have to go to music class or PE to do that. And so principals were asking for, teacher buyout time to be able to observe them in these other settings, when I think finally they realized teachers needed to restructure their classrooms and able to really be able to do this. Personally, I am a proponent of observational assessments and the early grades. And so that's a great example of one.
Thanks so much, Erica.
I
Christy,
would go.
Oh, go ahead, Ty.
I would go to what Chrissy said earlier, and that is that P2, P3 cannot be an afterthought, right? We have to center this. And I know as a former elementary school teacher that I saw the power of what was happening in my P3 classrooms and needed that to translate to other classrooms. If I could just tell a very quick story. I was walking down the hall of a kindergarten, in the kindergarten wing, and the students were engaged in an engineering project. I won't get into the specifics, but that's what I wanted in my 7th and 8th grade classrooms too. And so how do we think about the ways that we developmentally nurture our first, second, third grade students and make that translate so that we have buildings full of curiosity and joy and learning?
Christy, I think I heard you come off mute.
Yeah, I just had one other thing I wanted to add. Again, not sure what the specific metric is, but there's also an elegance and a simplicity question to this as well. I heard Nell Duke recently say that she had done an analysis of all of the different standards, like what our science of reading people say is the amount of time that should be spent on a day on reading, and the math specialists, what amount of time should be spent on early math, all of it, added it up. And an elementary school day would have to be something like 2.5 hours longer than it is in order to meet all of the recommended standards of people who care about young children's learning. But we've just stacked up so many expectations and requirements that it's very burdensome on our really devoted K-3 teachers, pre-K through 3rd grade teachers. And so I think and this goes to the science of learning and development, is that these little kids don't learn in content-specific areas only. How we think about integrated learning and sort of a daily schedule is, I think, so critical in these P3 years. And so again, I don't have a specific metric other than P3 success should not be measured by how much is being crammed into children's days. But what Ty said, how joyful and nurturing and sort of holistic they are, so that kids really love being at school rather than feeling like it's such a drag.
We'll double click on that, Christy. Thank you for that reflection. And that connects well to Steve's comment about a need to reconsider vision and systems. So I'd love to turn our attention at this point to our chat and questions from our audience. I will start with the question from Michael Little. And Christy, I saw that you answered it in the chat, but for the good of the full community, I'll read it. One thing I often hear from state and district leaders when talking about ECE leadership is this is interesting, this is important, but it is just not a key priority that we have time for with everything else going on. What is the most compelling way to convert people with this mindset?
I wrote my answer out in chat, so somebody else gets to talk first.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I can just talk about when we were at Illinois State University in the center, we were always really trying to integrate early childhood and early grade training to principals without much success. And so we developed a training module and we had few people participate in it. But then we started to rethink what our principals was most pressing of their time, what did they really need? And at that time, teacher evaluation was being implemented. So what we did is we took our trainings and we infused early grade content into those trainings. We actually led through funding from the McCormick Foundation, we did a validation study of the Danielson framework, which had been validated from third grade up, but not for early childhood and early grade teachers, because we wanted to see is that a validated assessment instrument for evaluating teachers. And then we created a repository of videos. I can share both of these in the chat that are videos done of early grade so pre-K, I'm sorry, kindergarten and first grade classrooms about highlighting what are some of these exemplary practices based on the Danielson domains. So I think what we've learned is you got to find out principals are so busy and they have so many competing interests, and you got to find out what are their needs and how do you infuse the message and broadened content you're trying to present to them in the way that they need it. So I think that's kind of one example I wanted to share.
I'll add that another Dick Elmore insight that, this one came from 2004, is he argued this reciprocity principle. So this is true for all of us in all of our organizations. He said, don't ever expect anybody to do anything differently than what they're currently doing unless you give them an opportunity to learn how to do it differently. And he was mainly aimed at principals working with teachers, but it's true for people in any organization. And so for me, getting leaders at all levels, this is state level, it's district level, it's school building level, to take seriously the power of P through 3 is a matter of providing the information in a way that that becomes compelling for them in their own self-interest. So, for example, if people want to improve third grade reading scores in a school district, unless they do P3 better, their chances of improving those scores are limited. If they do P3 a lot better, they're going to see better reading scores. And we need to provide the data for precisely that. So we've got to go with where people have their own particular interests and commitments, and help educate them about what are some of the ways that they can overcome their reticence. I will say, even after you pass legislation, you can get resistance. Erica and I experienced a couple of years ago a movement from principals associations in the state to get rid of the P part of the P through 12 endorsement, because they said things like, high school principals don't need to know this stuff. Why are we bothering high school principals with early childhood and P3 learning? And you just have to push back. And what we did was we did an education campaign to say, here's why you want to do that. And we did succeed. People dropped that opposition. Or one of the leading leaders in the state, I won't say who it was, said, look, I don't see why people need to have P3 leadership development. For me, leadership is leadership. If you get good at leadership, you're going to be good at. So we took it as our goal to educate him differently about that, and he dropped that position. But you can see how people have commitments to things that they believe in, and even if there's a lot of good research that says even if you provide data, people aren't going to pay attention to the data. So I'm not naive about that. But if you engage in relationships with people so that they have an educative experience around this, they can in fact change their minds. And it's absolutely true that people act in accord with their beliefs. And if we can get some belief shifting, we can get behavior change.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. I actually am a living, breathing example of that. I started my career as a high school teacher and had the luxury of experiencing P3 classrooms as a system leader, and am a believer of just how important it is for us to make an investment in time and resource in the development of our P3 principles. I'll turn back to the chat for a question from Aaron Ellis. How has multilingual school leadership been highlighted so that all students and families see themselves represented in schools and have a chance to collaborate with school leaders?
Ty, do you want to go after that at a
Yeah,
district level, and then we can talk about it in a wider scale?
Yeah, Chicago saw this huge influx of newcomers last year, and we are lucky to have a strong Office of Multilingual, Multicultural Education, in addition to having our strong Office of Early Childhood Education. This morning, I was at one of the schools in my neighborhood, Walsh Elementary School, that has a number of pre-K classrooms and a strong P-3 program that serves incomer students. But one of the priorities of the district has been around dual language programming. And I can say, as a former principal of an early childhood center, that bringing in those parents, like, we get those parents eager, right? And they want to come regardless of language. They want to be there because their babies are there. What we have to figure out is then how to keep them for years to come. There's a willingness that early grade parents come with, and we need to maximize on that.
Thanks, Ty.
I can talk from a state policy perspective. In Illinois, about 4 years ago, the State Board of Education implemented a new program called the New Principal Recruitment Program, and that's funded at 1.8 million per year. And the intention of that is really to diversify the principal pipeline. And so one program, Roosevelt University, received a grant for this, and they were preparing, their targeted audience was multilingual educators, teachers. So basically preparing multilingual teachers to become principals. We run a program in the ROE. Ours is called the Future Leaders Program, and we are supporting 30 educators of color with getting their principal endorsement. We are focused a lot on our target population includes Arab educators, because Illinois has a very large Arab population, but very few Arab leaders. So this is kind of a state policy, and there's example of how a state is directing some resources, and it allows universities and different organizations to apply to be providers for this. But that's just one example, I think, of how a state can influence and try to diversify the pipeline so you're getting leaders that reflect the needs of your student population.
I think that what Erica just said actually illustrates a particular principle here. Rotunda, you raised a problem of practice. How do we do better at this in multilingual kinds of environments and so on? And for me, the principle that Erica just sort of illustrated is you identify the problem of practice, then you identify the people who need to be brought together collaboratively to address it, and you make sure that it's a representative group so that people who are most closely affected by that problem of practice are on that particular problem solving group. So, I mean, Erica just gave us an illustration of that, but we certainly do it at the CPS level as well, Chicago Public Schools level. We've done it within the College of Education as well. Just a quick example from a higher ed, since higher ed is one of the 5 major drivers. In trying to answer the question, how do we create a pipeline with more Latino leaders in it, in particular Latino males in it, who are very thin in the pipeline? Let's figure out, is that our problem of practice, and who do we need to bring bring together to address that? And shouldn't we make sure that there are some Latino male leaders on that group? Right? In other words, so it's collaboration and representation around a problem of practice, and that is a way that for any difficulty we can move forward effectively.
Thanks so much, Steve. I hear this overwhelming repeated theme of collaboration throughout your responses. That is key, absolutely, to making approaches to the development and support of P3 principles of success. We have a question in the Q&A from Lottie Almonte. What are the statewide pedagogical practices and strategies that have leveraged positive student achievement outcomes?
I can speak to that. Just from work that I know of, is I know the state has been really instrumental in cultural and responsive standards that I think really embed how do you meet kids where they're at and how do you embrace that and how they learn. But they've also been, with the Common Core standards, that was a big driver in Illinois. But it also was a driver in making sure that the early childhood and early grades were included in that. And it was a full system of development. Because I know that the Common Core were seen as kind of a push down for many people in the early grades or in early childhood. So there was deliberate conversations to be making sure that there was this commonality. But it's not related to pedagogical, but the state did redesign all of its teacher preparation programs after the Common Core standards were implemented, knowing that they needed to narrow the grade span configurations. And the early childhood endorsement, which used to be a birth to grade 2, it was actually birth to grade 3, became a birth to grade 2, but the elementary endorsement became grade 1 to grade 6. And the reason for that, why the State Board of Education decided to do that, was they felt like kindergarten, in which kids can come in with multiple domains of learning, like they could socially, emotionally be at maybe a 3-year-old level, but in other learning domains be at a higher level, at a kindergarten or more. They felt like that need to understand the learning of that needed to be done by teachers that had that full continuum of training from birth to grade 2. That system is still in place, that configuration, but it's very controversial because it did make it harder for principals to be able to move teachers around. And so, all current teachers that had that old endorsement were licensed in, but this affected new teachers. I do think, personally, I'm in favor of it though, and I do think it has really affected the pedagogical development that our teachers in these early grades have on how kids learn.
Thank you, Erica. I am going to work to take 2 more questions from the chat before we close this exciting conversation. The first question that I'll start with is from Kate Austin. Kate would like to know, has Illinois aligned content standards between pre-K and K-3?
I am not familiar that they have. So Christy, you may know, though. I know you probably know what all states are doing. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't actually know the specific answer to that question. I'm guessing so. Most states have done some sort of alignment effort between their birth to 5 standards development benchmarks, whatever they're called, in a particular state, and K-12 standards. What I want to do is just deepen that question a little bit, is that let's just assume that Illinois has. To me, the next question, the deeper question is, it's going to go back to the human side of that, is in what ways are pre-K and K-3 teachers, whether pre-service, in service, being exposed to learning standards across the full continuum. Even if they're two separate sets of standards, that's still okay. Do the K-3 teachers know that pre-K standards exist? And what are they walking away with knowing that? So to me, it's not the alignment of the standards themselves that's so important. It's again, what's being put in front of teachers, not just as, follow these standards, but to grapple with. For second grade teachers to have a chance to really think about the foundational skills being developed in pre-K and K. For pre-K and K teachers to really understand what is that third grade benchmark that ultimately students are going to be getting to. So I'm not saying don't align standards if they're not aligned. I'm just saying that's only the first step in actually changing children's learning experiences inside classrooms year after year.
I've got to add something to that, Christy, which is that even if you do align standards, you're not going to get the kinds of results in children's learning that you want to get unless, in fact, each school becomes a place of adult learning. So that a corollary to your response and that fits with it is the following. One of the things that we were pleased to see after 10 years of the new principal endorsement in Illinois, 2025 is the 10th year of the first graduates under that endorsement, is that Illinois got called out by the Harvard Stanford team as being one of the states that rebounded most quickly from COVID. From the learning loss on COVID. Eric and I have talked about this a little bit, and how do you explain that? Part of your explanation is school leadership there, and so what every school leader in Illinois is supposed to be exposed to is the belief that what your instructional and pedagogical problems of practice are can't be addressed unless you engage the teachers collaboratively in addressing them. If our third grade math outcomes are lousy, the solution to that is to bring the teachers together at P-3 and say, what are we doing? What should we be doing? So really the answer to the pedagogical question comes out of a book that Tony Breich released in 2010 called Organizing Schools for Improvement. Outstanding pedagogy is not a property of individuals so much as it's a property of how the organization supports individuals in learning to teach better than they're currently teaching, right? So the idea is that it's not so much the pedagogy, are the schools as organizations, are the districts as organizations supporting teacher growth in pedagogy? If they're not, there's not much hope.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I had hoped to get to one more question, but I hope that one of our fantastic panelists will respond to Deborah's thoughtful question about the ways in which principals are being prepared to look at instruction vertically and horizontally. I, at this time, just want to take a moment to thank our fantastic panelists for such a rich dialogue. It has been insightful to me, and I know that it has been for the nearly 100 participants on this webinar today. At this time, I will turn the floor back over to our friends at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading to close us out.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Rotunda. You did such a phenomenal job leading the conversation. So a round of applause for you as well. And to our panelists, thank you, Christy, Erica, Steve, Ty. All of you were fantastic. I hope you were seeing and you can see them now, all of the love and the claps that are coming in from our attendees today. So thank you so much again. It was great to feature your voices and to learn from you. As a reminder to our attendees who are here with us, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording, all of the great resources, the books, the links, the bios, the slides. All of that great information will be included in the follow-up email that will get sent to you later this week. So keep an eye on that. That will be arriving in your inbox. And before you hop off, just a reminder and an encouragement to join us again if you liked today's conversation. We will be having 2 exciting webinars next week on May 6th. The first, a Crucible of Practice Salon at 12:30, focusing on first 10 communities in early math. And I think I saw 1 or 2 of those panelists in today's conversation. Also that same day, we'll be having a very important conversation on schools as safe places, kind of looking beyond active shooter drills to trusting relationships. And later in the month of May, we have some more opportunities on May 13th and May 20th, with more information being posted in the chat now, so you can take a look there. And of course, keep an eye on our website and on our Zoom page where we will be posting all of the great updates, resources, and registration links. Thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and I appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.